Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm Alia Eshaq, Managing Partner of Mashur Group, and will be moderating today's event, which would look at East Africa. At Mashur Group, we aim to understand current and emerging economic opportunities in East Africa, particularly interregional trade and investment relations between East Africa and the Arab Gulf. We would also like to shed light on the latest developments. On the one hand, we're witnessing promising intensified regional integration. However, on the other hand, a global pandemic continues and a new alarming conflict in Ethiopia are causes for alarm. So what does this all mean? To answer these questions, we have invited an esteemed panel of experts who for the next hour and a half will help us understand the developments and help us know what to expect. We will start with a brief presentation from each of the speakers, around 10 minutes for each. Then we will move on into Q&A. If you have any questions throughout the presentations, please feel free to send your questions at the Q&A section, along with your name and the name of your organization. My colleagues and I will try our best to cover all your questions. Now, if you have any questions, please send them throughout. You don't have to wait until it's Q&A time. We actually encourage you to do that. This will give us enough time to sort out your questions and make sure that we address them. So joining us today, Her Excellency Ambassador Dr. Namira Negm, Legal Counsel and Director of the Department of Legal Affairs at the African Union, Miguel Azevedo, Head of Investment Banking for the Middle East and Africa at Citigroup, and Aloysius Uche Ordu, Senior Fellow and Director of Africa Growth Initiative at Brookings. Without any further ado, let us start our conversation today, and we will start with Dr. Negm. If you could please walk us through the current state of affairs at the East Africa and the opportunities and the challenges. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alia, and it's my pleasure to join you today, and thank you for inviting me for this webinar. As all of you know, that the goal of the East African community is simply to widen and deepen economic, political, social, and cultural integration in order to improve the quality of life of the people in East Africa through their competitiveness, value-added production, trade and investment. And the original main goal of the establishment of the East African community is to lead to the establishment of a federation. This is, of course, a very optimistic target that I don't see it happening so soon. The challenges and the opportunities of promoting the regional cooperation within Africa is not unique. The attempts, of course, are all around the continent. So you will find we have ECAS, ECOWAS, and other regions. We have several blocks attempting at fostering integration in the continent, while East Africa can be named as one of the promising ones because of the similarities, yet of course they have differences. The similarities that we have in the East African region comes from close ethnicity, ideologies, religions. Some of these are like pretty close, but it still can be a factor of challenges as well. This is always like the devil is in the details, as we say. So we have a region hosts 312 million people, stretched over all the 11 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. This is the East African bloc. The EAC itself, the treaty, was established and signed by Burundi, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, Uganda, and later South Sudan acceded, which means that not all the East African region are part of the East African community. This is very important to note because the threats coming from outside of the East African community as a bloc affects the East African community a lot. When it comes to the current opportunities and challenges, as I mentioned before, the common language, history, and a lot of the cross-border affinity among these African countries shows an opportunity rather than a challenge, which is, for example, I'm using, of course, my experience as a previous ambassador to Rwanda to understand the region. So simply, the people on the borders between Uganda and Rwanda share everything, ethnicity, religion, social activities, economic activities, they are similar. However, this as such can facilitate the establishment of an aspired federation, for example. Yet, for example, the challenge, as we have witnessed recently, the closure of the main crossing point between the two countries several times over political differences. So simply, if we copy the same, when we are talking about Rwanda, Burundi, they were one under Banya Rwanda. They have the same ethnical heritage, everything, they are the same. Yet, with the current state of affairs, the relations deteriorated since 2015 between the two countries. So, of course, these are all factors to create obstacles to the perceived integration within the East African community. The ethnicity factor is part and parcel when we addressing Africa and when we address, of course, East Africa and the East African community. Within one country, like for example, Kenya, we have witnessed a lot of skirmishes and clashes in 2008 after the election. So even with the established modern state, we are still witnessing a lot of problems arising originally from ethnicity. This affects not only the country itself, but also its neighbors. And this is also affecting the region and, of course, the integration. Now, if we speak about South Sudan, for example, which is now part of this African community, South Sudan is still very fragile. We have witnessed the civil war. We have witnessed an agreement for peace, then fallout of the agreement, then revitalized agreement, and we are all watching very closely what will happen in South Sudan. We, of course, I will jump later into the effects of COVID on all of us. So, of course, this kind of stability affects also the integration within the East African community. The other issue, which is very important to note, is the differences in the capacity within the countries of the East African community. Although we can say there is a possibility of complementarity by sharing resources and creating common markets, especially for jointly produced products, and here I would just copy, just an example, heavyweight industries may flourish better in coastal states, while the lighter weight products can be produced in landlocked countries. Think of the price of shipping a car versus shipping a medicine. So this is something can be usefully for the integration among the bloc. Yet, of course, because of the difference of the levels of industrialization within the bloc, as well as the competition between them, which sometimes for me unrealistic, because like even if we try to overcome difficulties of geography and difficulties of capacities, it is not sustained on the long run. So this is something also we have to bear in mind. So we have really unrealistic competition within the bloc that also doesn't assist a lot in the complementarity aspect. The other issue, which is very clear, the coastal states benefit from the landlocked countries. So they will always be jeopardizing any effort to the landlocked countries to find alternatives for using the ports, because maybe if they will have hubs or having these the kind of land ports that will save them money in shipment, you will find the coastal states against that, because it will affect their own revenues coming from their big ports. So that's also another challenge that we have to think about when we are talking about economic integration. The other issue is sometimes the EAC efforts politically um, proved sometimes to be efficient as a political mediator mechanism within the region, and sometimes not. So, for example, the EAC led the political process in Burundi, while Angola and Congo, the DRC Congo, are the ones who brokered the friendship agreement between Rwanda and Uganda not long ago. So this shows that even within the same bloc, they weren't able to mediate among themselves to reach a political solution rather than others going for it. The other factor, which is not a challenge, but it's an opportunity for now, is the strong political will of the current leadership within the East African community, which actually served as a catalyst behind the speedy attempt to integrate within the community. This is beneficial, but this cannot be sustained. This is another issue because the deterioration in this will also be met with a vanishing in the attempts of integration. So, further institutionalization of the process within the community is required to have more sustainable integration. For example, the establishment of the common budget or monetary union will assist a lot in this. Why? Because when we have further economic integration, monetary integration, it will be very difficult for one country to decide on its own to withdraw. I will just think out of the tip of my head of compare the UK and Brexit, although they were not as involved as other EU countries within the EU community, but Brexit is showing the difficulties of withdrawing from agreements establishing some level of unity. The also one challenge is the multiple memberships of the members of the bloc in different economic blocs. If we're talking about different tracks, like members of the EAC, some of them are members of the EGAD, some of them are members of the COMESA, some of them are members of the SADC. And don't forget the newly adopted CFTA agreement, which is actually now also will take over at a certain stage from the EAC rules. This is also something that is considered a challenge for one of the regions in Africa. The for us, I do believe that the economic integration is going to be part and parcel and essential prerequisite for the political integration, and this is where we believe that seeking this further economic integration will assist. We have, like, we can compare the current state with the process that took place in the EU, for example, that we can say that classically there are five major stages of economic integration: free trade area, preferential trade area, customs union, common market, monetary union, and of course, ultimately a political union. Just like the EU, the EEC has attempted to follow the chronological order. It worked and it didn't work in parts. The EAC, for example, established in 1999 the customs union between Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda. And of course, it was also followed by following the Benelux formula before Schengen, where the three countries had one visa. So you're a visitor from outside, you'll have one visa for the three countries. This assists a lot as a nucleus for the aspired integration within the EAC. But this, of course, didn't follow exactly the same model of the EU as well, because they skipped some stages when it comes to the economic integration. The common market is the third stage, and also it is supposed to assist a lot in the integration, which is already established within the EAC. It is still aspiring to establish the monetary union by 2024, but we are yet to see, because the attempts to fast track the integration so far, especially the federation, has not been materialized, because there are still a lot of factors to mitigate such attempts, and we are derailed by different aspects in the region. Now, moving to the external challenges around the EAC, but part of the challenges within the East African region. As we mentioned, we have within the region already South Sudan that is not stable. Then if you look at around it, you think of the DRC Congo. The DRC Congo, the conflict and the violence that took place in its eastern part forced over 50,000 civilians to flee the area. Where do they go? They go to the border countries, which is EAC countries: Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, and sometimes Tanzania. So this also that affects the burden on the countries that have to receive all of these refugees. Now, you mentioned in the introduction the conflict in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the biggest country in number in East African region. Any conflict will affect its regions, the entire region, and it will affect all the other countries in the East African bloc. The area is very volatile. We have witnessed the current problem in Tigray. We do have some information, but we lack the full picture of what's going on there. But the impact of, and let's start by saying and identifying that Tigray is a small region in Ethiopia. It's not a big region within Ethiopia itself. Yet, because of this conflict in Tigray region, we have witnessed number one, Eritrea suffering from rocket attacks. Number two, Sudan and Eritrea witnessed a spillover of civilians fleeing the region. 40,000 Ethiopians fled the Tigray region into those two countries. Of course, we also have reports of the Sudanese forces deploying troops on the disputed area on the borders of Ethiopia. This all constitutes a big threat between the East Africa communities and the East Africa community as a bloc. Don't forget the Shabab in Somalia. The Shabab in Somalia is still a constant threat to the stability of Kenya and countries in the region. So all of these developments are constantly affecting the stabilization of the entire region and, of course, the East African community. One thing before moving on to the COVID effects is the corruption challenges in the region. We have so many reports on the issue, and its effect cannot be missed because it has direct impact on the economic growth of the countries that form the East African community. The last challenge I want to address is the challenges posed by COVID-19. It was first reported in the region in March 2009. Steps were taken in order to curb drastically the spread of the pandemic, while the ramifications of the pandemic is of course all over the world, all over Africa, and especially on a volatile economic region and volatile security situation in Africa. There were reports when the closures started that around the world there will be stability caused by the socio-economic impacts of the pandemic. This is something we should not forget, especially in already countries. If you think about the number of countries that are considered very low income countries or middle income countries, where already the poverty is spread. The other issue is the unregistered economy, because it's how many daily paid workers suffered in these countries because of the closures, and the effect is really, really deep when it comes to the economic impacts. So to conclude, the EAC as a bloc is one of the aspiring blocs within the continent and progressive in the ambition towards effectuating economic and political integration. However, many challenges internally in the states that affect the peaceful transition of power in some of the countries, that affect the democratic changes, the ethnic challenges, economic challenges are all still huge in the region, with a lot of negative impacts on the integration within the East African community. This fragility itself will always continue to be a threat in the region. We just hope that security will be better, because in reality, without economic integration and without security, there is no political integration. Like the economic integration, without the political will, there will not be political integration, and without peace and security, there will be no economic development and integration. I'll stop at that, and I thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Negm. That was a very, very interesting presentation. I've noted down, you've mentioned some opportunities, the fact that there is shared cultural heritage and what seems to be a strong political will driving this integration. However, on the other hand, there is a lack of institutionalization of this process. It's a question of competition that is sometimes not very effective, question of which states benefit more, whether there's a balance there. It seems that coastal states might be benefiting more. Also, multiple memberships is another challenge, in addition, obviously, to the external challenges related to members of East Africa that are not within the EAC, such as Ethiopia, and obviously corruption challenges and COVID-19. So that's a lot of challenges that we need to tackle. Now let's move on into the investment climate, and we'll hear from Miguel. Miguel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a hard hack to follow after such a comprehensive review of the current situation and challenges. But let me try to use a very simple framework in terms of addressing how the region can make an investment proposition an attractive proposition. I will try to follow a very simple framework, as I said, and this will be basically saying, from a strictly economic standpoint, what you need to maximize is the return for the investor. And the return for investor is achieved by, managing two variables. One is creating the environment for a maximization of the cash flow that investors can produce in the region. And the second element, and this is a ratio, is minimizing the risk premium that investors will require to invest in the region, hence minimizing the cost of capital to invest in the region. And the higher the cash flow and the lower the cost of capital, the bigger will be the return, the bigger will be the interest in investing in the region. So, borrowing from this framework, let me start by addressing the first one, i.e. maximizing the potential cash flow. And I'm going to put EAC in the context of, what makes investors feel attracted by one particular region. And size matters. That's the first point. Being a region as similar within itself as possible, laws, seamless trading between the countries, infrastructure on the ground that facilitates that, call it superstructure in terms of the flow of people, the flow of information, the flow of connectivity between the countries. So size is very, very important. No country in the region is very big. I will address Ethiopia separately, but no country in the region is very big. And if we put all together and we get to the sort of the 150 million people mark, that is unique. And 150 million people market with attractive growth rates, it's not unique around the world, but there are not that many. So this starts making it very compelling as an investment proposition. Now, if you start considering adding Ethiopia to this region, and there is a strong argument for that, proximity, flows between the countries, then all of a sudden we are in the 250 million size area. That's becoming really unique. And in my view, everything that can be done to facilitate trade, facilitate investment, and facilitate connectivity between these regions, these countries within the region, can only be beneficial to everyone, and and each country on its own. I can even see this region being a gateway to southern or parts of Southern Africa. The ambassador mentioned DRC. I could mention Mozambique. I could mention even the Zambia, Zimbabwe area, and we see some players from the region investing there. So it's becoming really unique opportunity. So that's the first thing. The second element to maximize the cash flow, I would say, would be to have integrated financial markets. This will allow people to invest, to move money around the region, to borrow wherever necessary, to make the whole proposition work more smoothly. And so it's very important that we are now assisting or watching the emergence of regional banks, primarily Kenyan banks, but I'm sure there will be others. We are seeing the green shots of the creation of a regional stock exchange, namely between Tanzania, Rwanda, and Uganda. I remember many years ago having visited the Dar es Salaam Stock Exchange and discussing this topic, and my counterpart started rolling his eyes and saying, "No, that's just not possible." It's happening. Obviously, it's critical to have Kenya in the mix, and I believe it will happen, and this will make the region so much more attractive. The third element I would raise here is let's call it the government in the region not having a crowding out effect, i.e. the governments in the region should not aim to be investors themselves in sectors that they are not supposed to be investors. Let private initiative, and there's plenty in the region, let foreign investors do what they are supposed to do, and focus yourself in building the infrastructure and the public goods that are necessary for an economy to work. And this brings me to the fourth point. I could go on and on, which is governments need to provide a minimum level of infrastructure. They don't necessarily need to build the infrastructure themselves or to fund the infrastructure themselves, because they will not be able to, but create the legal framework, create the economic framework so that you can attract capital into the region to create the infrastructure, whether it is railways going from Mombasa all the way to Kampala, whether it is pipelines going from Uganda through Tanzania, crossing Kenya, whatever, building the port infrastructure that can serve the region and not necessarily just one country. Absolutely critical to make this region even more attractive. Now, as I said, I was using the maximizing cash flow and the minimizing cost of capital approach. So let me discuss a little bit the minimization of the cost of capital, which I think is very important. So the first point I would make is solid macroeconomic policy management by the countries. We have seen that when we talk about investors investing in Africa, everybody gets very excited with the opportunity, the market, the entrepreneurial spirit, and that's what I usually call there's the micro, i.e. the corporate level premium, very exciting companies. But then comes the macroeconomic issue, and what I call the macro discount, which is usually and not even usually, is always connected to less than solid, let me put it that way, macroeconomic management by the countries. Running perennial current account deficits is just a way of creating foreign exchange issues, foreign exchange devaluation, increasing the risk of investing in the region. So let's make sure that they manage macro policy macroeconomic policy correctly. But more important, even more important than that, is creating the right background, the right framework for economic development at the micro level, i.e. Making sure that they give the right signals, the right policies to improve and incentivize local production that is either import substitution or export driven. These countries need to export, and I think East Africa actually ranks relatively well vis-a-vis other regions in Africa, but not as good as they can and they should, in my view. So that's very important to create the right incentives, which has to do, with some of the issues that we've discussed before around the infrastructure as well. Then finally, I would say, and now I'm thinking of some countries in particular where we have seen some political decisions which were very well intentioned in terms of managing the discount, managing the interest rate, but effectively they were flawed and they had very negative consequences. So it's very important to measure the decisions governments take and what the impact is in terms of making credit available to everyone at different prices. At different prices, not everyone should get the credit at the same price because the risk is different, but everyone should have credit available. And as you know, in Kenya, when there was the policy of interest rate caps, that created a massive problem, which I think everyone now understands and agrees is not right. So let's make sure that all the policies are growth-driven, growth-friendly, and making the market economy work better, not the other way around. So these are simple things that at the end of the day, when someone is sitting maybe in New York, maybe in Berlin, or in Beijing, and when they are doing their calculations, they will do these calculations. How much can I produce of cash flow? What is the cost of capital applicable to this particular region? So that's very, very important. The other thing is East Africa is doing better than many other regions. If they can further increase the catchment area and they can run some of these issues that we have discussed before, I think they are in a unique position to attract more capital. We can discuss that in Q&A. I see a lot of interest from many regions, including the Gulf, given the proximity, to invest in the region. There are some notable privatizations going on, namely in Ethiopia. We have seen private companies, and I can mention a few examples, in the Gulf that are seeing the opportunity in East Africa to invest in logistics, invest in financial technology, in fintech. So it's not that nothing is happening. It is happening, but a lot more can happen. And I think we are so close to make that happen. It would be quite a disappointment if we cannot really grab that opportunity. Let me stop here for now. And happy to take Q&A at the right time. Back to you, Alia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miguel, for this very clear and concise presentation, which was mainly around these 2 points of maximizing cash flow and minimizing cost of capital. And you mentioned some very interesting remarks. One which I noted is this macro discount that is happening. We always hear about this, very interesting entrepreneurship, things happening, very interesting initiatives, and we get too excited. But then at the same time, there's a lot of, macro level policies that need to be in line with what's happening on the micro level. So yeah, thank you for pointing that out. All right, so we'll move on now to Dr. Aloysius. You're going to talk to us about the future of EAC and your expectations for that. The floor is yours.
Alia, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. And good morning, everyone, wherever you're connected from. Thanks, Miguel and Ambassador Namira. I think it was great to have set the stage. I think many of what you actually articulated, I fully share. Alia, your point is basically that I look forward and what EAC could be like in the future. This is important for many reasons, because the current focus on our continent, on the pandemics, we often forget that there is a future hereinafter. If you remember back in history, Europe went through the Great Black Plague. Everybody thought the fortunes of Europe would end as a result of that plague. But what actually happened is instructive for us. Europe, after the plague, there was the great renaissance in the European continent. As you know, at that time, unparalleled transformation in history of mankind. It unleashed innovations in arts, in science, in politics, in literature, economics, and indeed the transformation of the social order of that continent. COVID-19 is indeed a black swan. Already it has changed our lives the way we know it in the world, right? I mean, the way we work, the way we travel, the way we interact, completely changed. But this is the beginning, right? COVID is not yet done in terms of the abundance, transformative effects it could have on us. So that raises a number of questions, particularly the one you posed. What could East Africa look like in the future? Let's just say 2050. And why is the future important for the trade and investment relations of this region and the Gulf states? So looking ahead, you can already begin to see from what Ambassador Namira said, and then of course, what Ms. Miguel articulated. Here are some of the things we already know right now. One, that Congo DRC will indeed join the ERC this year or by 2022, all right? And in the years ahead, again, as mentioned by the previous speakers, I actually believe Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, and Sudan would probably follow as members of the EAC, ensuring, therefore, a potentially enlarged EAC of a dozen countries. So think about that. What does that mean by 2050? So Africa's population would have doubled to over 2 billion, which means that 2 in 5 human beings on the planet will be an African, all right? The enlarged EAC's population using the UN projection will mean that EAC will be 900 million people, the 12 members. That means that EAC will have 200 million more people than the entire population of Europe, and 400 more million people than the entire population of North America. So East Africa could thus become a booming consumer market with young people constituting the biggest share. This could spur economic growth and the so-called demographic dividend. The enlarged EAC could become a beacon of regional growth and prosperity, ushering in unparalleled development with impressive connectivity, trade and investments, etc. And we heard Miguel talk extensively and very rightly so about the maximization of returns, and indeed, which he put in a very nice way, minimum risk, minimizing the risk premium, and indeed maximizing cash flows and return. So that kind of huge and vibrant region would basically be what East Africa, when you look at 2050, would be looking like. In other words, for Miguel and the people he advises and his colleagues, Miguel will be able to tell these guys that global investors in search of emerging market yields would probably flood to East Africa or regret their lack of exposure in this vibrant region by 2050. So that's the sort of East Africa we can aspire to, in spite of some of the challenges that Ambassador Namira obviously mentioned, which we cannot discount. Now, so what I've painted is a rosy picture. It's not without challenges indeed. Remember, housing, schools, hospitals will be needed in abundance. More food will have to be grown to feed the growing population. More sanitation, broadband, roads, bridges, airports, railways, you name it, all the dimensions of infrastructure will be needing them in huge numbers in order to generate the returns that Miguel adequately articulated. What does all that mean? lots of jobs for the young people. And it will need to be, they will need to be created because of the burgeoning population, as we indicated. So policies that favor building robust institutions, policies that favor good governance, and policies that favor infrastructure investments will be particularly important. These are the key to attaining economic prosperity in the enlarged East African region of 2050. Alia, there's, of course, no way to tell that the region will actually be like I've just articulated. What we know, though, is that the region could experience unprecedented changes if and only if the leaders and policymakers take concerted actions. The issues at stake here involve political choices. At the end of the day, it's about political choices. Miguel mentioned railways. Yes, take railways, for instance. Remember, in the 19th century, railways completely transformed the United States of America, where I'm currently living now. And railways are not new in East Africa. Back in 1913, the Germans sketched the broad outlines of a railway line that would run from Dar es Salaam to Kigali and Bujumbura, which were all German protectorates, as you know. The First World War killed the idea. The German design was basically used by the African Development Bank as a basis to develop, to revisit that same alignment in order to basically launch and commission a railway line linking these countries by the centennial year 2013. That effort too did not materialize, as we know. The former East African services also included railway lines linking Kenya and Uganda. The collapse of the EAC of old ensured the demise of the idea. So fast forward to today, and again, Miguel mentioned, right? Reviving the Dar es Salaam, Isaka, Bujumbura, Kigali line is back on the agenda. The first phase, as we all know, in Dar es Salaam is under construction. Part of the Northern Line, Mombasa, Nairobi, is already operational, thank God. The extension to Kenya, to Kampala, Juba, and Kisangani in Congo DRC will ultimately follow. This would dramatically reduce transport costs, freight costs in the region with many landlocked countries. So by 2050 then, we could see the Northern Line could link the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic, connecting DRC's thriving city of Kisangani and westward to the Lagos metropolis. The Nairobi line could also connect Mogadishu, Addis Ababa, Djibouti, Asmara, and Khartoum. The same with highways. Highways could basically connect East and West Africa. Dar es Salaam, Dodoma, Bujumbura, Kinshasa, et cetera, et cetera. The same applies to ports. I mean, in terms of the port servicing many of these East African region. And then airlines also. COVID may have challenged us right now, but when you're looking forward strategically to 2050, it will be a completely different dispensation. Air transport will be absolutely catalytic in the East African region. The IATA projects that aviation demand on the continent will be more than double in the next 2 decades. Here too, there are likely to be 3 dominant hubs in the East Africa region. First, the Addis Ababa, Bishoflu. Second, the Bugesera, Kigali, and third, the Nairobi. These 3 hubs would ensure superior continental and global connectivity, carrying over 100 million passengers per year by the year 2050. These are by no means exhaustive of what could happen, but they illustrate some of the aspects of infrastructure that could boost growth and transform the economies of East Africa. Because when we focus on the immediate now, here and now, we also need to take cognizance of the fact that this very COVID environment will trigger and unleash the kind of prosperity we did not have before if the leaders actually basically pay heed to this. Remember, projections show that if Africa maintains an annual 6% growth for the next 3 decades, and they were on course to doing that, all the East African countries except one, Burundi, were indeed growing at over 6%, as you know, before the pandemic. So if our African countries grew at 6%, they could generate 24 trillion US dollars, 24 trillion. With most of the world's rapidly growing economies currently in East Africa, the region will clearly contribute to a great share of the 24 trillion. So most of you must be thinking now, Aloysius, where is the money for all this? Where will the money come from? Indeed, much has been written about the huge financing requirement for an integrated and prosperous Africa. There is no denying that money is important. The Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, and as well as the African Development Bank, project a infrastructure financing gap of 100 billion, basically for the next decade. Now, we also know that these infrastructure are important, and Miguel articulated, in order for us to attract investors, we will need key dimensions of infrastructure. But in my experience, the thing missing are the following three. One, ideas. Ideas matter. Having concrete ideas translated into bankable projects are key to securing financing to integrate East Africa. There are two other factors that are very, very important: trust and institutions. The key to realizing the vision articulated this morning of an integrated region lies in building trust, especially amongst the leaders of East Africa and policymakers. It also requires their collaboration and sustained efforts to build systematically credible institutions. Evidently, you cannot buy trust, as we all know. Right? And like trust, credible institutions can only be built over time, the kind that endures and outlasts individual leaders. If you're in doubt, think of what's happening in the United States today. You only need one leader who can just basically decimate and crush existing institutions. So we need to guard against the need to build a trustful relationship and ensure that we build credible institutions. So an integrated and thriving East Africa, is attainable by 2050. To get there requires engaged leaderships that's determined to build strong institutions of governance, that are trusting in their relationship with each other, and are focused on a common transformational idea, an agenda for a prosperous and competitive East Africa. What has the Gulf states got to do with all this? Absolutely critical. They have a great role to play in the East African development we painted. Many of the Gulf states have huge current account surpluses, even now, and reserves. And the returns, as Miguel cautioned us, elsewhere in emerging markets are very, very low. Interest rates are really, in many countries, very low. So where do you get better returns now? East Africa clearly presents incredible, attractive opportunity for the Gulf states to, for enhanced trade and investment relations with the members of the East Africa region. Thank you very, very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Aloysius. That was very, very interesting. And I'm glad that you mentioned, this optimistic vision. I think it's good sometimes to, think as well of the possibilities and what could happen if things go well. So thank you so much for that. We already have a few questions. Let me start with a question for each one of you. I'm going to start with Miguel. We have a question here from Hadi Halabi from Deloitte. He asks, regarding the first cash flow maximization scenario you mentioned, can governments afford the significant government spending required, especially to maximize cash flows through infrastructure spending? And for Ambassador Negm, if you could maybe expand a little bit on the conflict in Ethiopia And what should we expect right now in terms of, you know, this having an impact and spilling over into other countries? How serious is this? And Aloysius, if you could talk a bit about the free trade agreement, the African Free Trade Agreement, and how this impacts the EAC. Does it become redundant in a way, and the impact of that? So if we could start with Miguel, and then Dr. Negm, and then Aloysius. Miguel.
Yes. So very quickly, yes, I know the availability of budget capacity is a major issue in East Africa, in Africa, in all over the world, effectively. Maybe China is the only exception there. So it's nothing new. The issue is governments should be doing what no one else can do, and they should create the right framework for private initiative, local or foreigner, but you know, people that can develop those other infrastructures so that they can develop it. And so I would, you know, again, trying to be simplistic here, and simple and simplistic. You have commercial infrastructure, call it, you know, ports, airports, some toll roads around main cities. Those can be exploited in a very commercial, short-term basis. Don't spend your dollars in building those. Let others build. You control those infrastructures through regulation. No one is going to take the airport from Nairobi and take it somewhere else. That's not a risk. It's not going to happen. So let investors deal with that, create the right regulation that is investor friendly, but also citizen protective. And then spend your dollars in the other infrastructure that is more long-term oriented. And that doesn't pay off so fast. And develop that and finance that, obviously, through your own means. Taxes on one hand, but you can borrow for those projects. If you then deploy the money properly, you know, at world-class standards, world-class cost, and world-class time-effective implementation, that's what governments should be doing. They should not aim to do everything. They should select what they do and let others do what they can allow others do. Otherwise, as the question implies, there's not enough money to go everywhere. Definitely.
Thank you, Miguel. Dr. Ning?
Thank you so much, Alia. And I would like to thank both presenters for a very enriching discussion. When it comes to the issue of Ethiopia, as I mentioned when I first intervened, that we lack information of what is really going on the ground. We have very limited source to verify what's going on. So far, we've seen the impact with refugees, but we didn't see the rest. We don't know, we cannot predict how the spillover will be further than the refugee issue. Will it widespread within Ethiopia itself? This is something is yet to be seen. Expected to have some terrorist attacks within, like specifically Addis Ababa. It's possible. We've seen a bit here or there. It's still contained, but we don't know what will happen because within Addis Ababa alone, we have 1 million Tigray. So we don't know what will be the impact within Ethiopia. The other issue, which is very important, I didn't mention, but I think Dr. Ordu mentioned in relation to the age span of the Africans. The continent is considered the youngest continent in the world, where it's like more than 50% of the population of Africa is youth. This is also, again, an opportunity and a challenge. It's an opportunity because you can use this population, the young population, very well in order to build good human resources Yet the current situation in Africa and in the East expels the good youth. They will, if they find a way to go to bigger countries in Africa to have better life, they will go. If they can go to the West, they will go to the West. I'm talking about the north of Africa, like the Western Hemisphere, because they aspire for a better life. So this is a good aspect, but it's a negative aspect also if it might affect security, because a suicide bomber will never be 60 and above. 90% of the time, it will be someone in the 20s, in the teens, and so on. So this also can be a threat, especially if we're talking about Ethiopia. Like, it's a big population with a big number of youth. We don't know what will happen. The level of education and the level of awareness, even among this youth, might be different from one aspect to another. So this is a problem which may affect, on one hand, brain drainage among the youth. The second issue, which I think is very important to mention here, is the threat of health, because we are not a healthy population. Africa is not a healthy population. Like, COVID added extra problems, but we have a lot of pandemics, a lot of like cholera, yellow fever, HIV, AIDS, name it. So also that affects our youth to make sure that to have good labor, you need healthy labor. So this is also something that affects us to a great extent. The connectivity, because I heard the colleague speaking about the infrastructure. Yes, we have a major, of course, problem with infrastructure in the region. But now with what's happening in Ethiopia, is a link between some of the countries in the region and the rest that also affects the movement. Like the rockets on Asmara blocked the airport. No flies going out of Asmara. This is also another issue that you can see. It's affecting the movement of goods and persons in the region. Of course, it will also affect the situation. So it's a composition of factors. We are yet to see the real impact of what's going on in Ethiopia, because we are, of course, still waiting for the elections. And we don't know what will come with the elections, because in the region in general, always elections come with some issues. So we don't know, the issues will be contained or the issues will be enlarged. We don't know. Today we know who is ally with who, but will that continue? We don't know. This is the major problem within a country as big as Ethiopia. Today we know the political alliances between the government and the other ethnic regions. Will it remain? Will it change? We don't know. The impact of the arrest of political leaders of regions. Some, yes, of course, because they incite for violence, separatists against the constitution. We understand that. But the whole issue is not about what we understand. It's about the impact of what is going on, even if it's a legal right of the government to secure the people and make sure there is no further escalation of violence and terrorist attacks taking place, but it will impact big groups within the country. This is very difficult as we speak right now to perceive what will happen next. We are yet to verify reports that come in the media. We are yet to verify what happened with different ethnicities in the Tigray region. Like, we have a massacre that took place and we don't know who committed what. And this has been ongoing for a while. It's like what happened now is just bringing it too much to the surface, but it was going on before, but on a smaller scale. And this will affect also the Tigray living in other regions, because there are Tigray in Oromia, there are Tigray in Amhara. It's not like we cannot say that it's only this region that hosts the Tigray. No, it's a federation, so people move around. So this is all one of the major issues that we have to think about. And just before I conclude, the issue of the consumption and having a bloc like Ethiopia, even within the East African community, if it reaches the level of stability we are aspiring for, and it will come in the entire region, the consumption equates to resources. If you don't have resources, you have big number of people, but they don't have the money to consume. So this is also a major problem that we have to think about, because we're talking about some of these countries are below the poverty line. Most of the people are really, really in dire need of basic living necessities. So we might have a big number of people, but we might have, like with the development, good production. That doesn't mean we will have people to be able to buy. I didn't speak on the other external factors outside of the region, because in one of the questions in relating to Sudan and the United States, there are others, because you have other interests of the Europeans, of China, and other players who also affect the region. I'll stop at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Negm. Before we hear from Dr. Aloysius, just a quick follow-up question, since we're talking about Ethiopia. Do you think that if Ethiopia is indeed moving towards joining the EAC at some point? I mean, what's your analysis of that?
I'm sure it's on the agenda, but I cannot tell that is a priority right now. The current priority for the Ethiopian government is to ensure the stability of Ethiopia and to ensure the continuation of the federation of Ethiopia, because this is the major threat today. Once Ethiopia crosses that line for a better level of stability, definitely EAC will be part and parcel of the agenda, especially if we continue with the current prime minister, because he's very progressive when it comes to the economic aspects. His hands are pretty tight because he is leading a transition government, not the aftermath of elections. So whenever he wants to go for like a privatization or opening up the market a bit, he's always faced with criticism internally, saying you don't have the right to take that decision now. You are a temporary government. So if things develop with a stability scenario, and we have the same prime minister after elections, which is perceived that this will be the case, then we might find more opening to the Ethiopian market, which is anyways a challenge in the entire region, because like Kenya is more open than Ethiopia. So having it is hampering the development in Ethiopia, and it affects the level of FDI coming into Ethiopia. So once they open a bit their markets, definitely, of course, under CFTA, they will be part and parcel of it. They are still ongoing to think of how to do their tariffs and so on. But at the end of the day, they realize to an extent, to have real development in Ethiopia, they need more investment. To need more investment, it will not come with a 50 or 60s model. You need to open up your market. But on which way and which models they will follow, this is yet to be seen, because we don't know. Because you can have like in the 70s in Egypt, when you opened up everything and we ended up in a disaster leading to major corruption, or you will open up gradually and privatize gradually, that you will not impact so much the lives of people, and you follow a model like East Germany with West Germany, like where you preserve the rights of labor and so on, but you go into a more open policy market. But of course, I do predict once Ethiopia is stabilized, EAC will be part and parcel of their agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nick. Dr. Aloysius?
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much, Alia. And indeed, Ambassador, I fully concur with you. And Alia, let me just very quickly make a point on Miguel's point, because the question to supplement was basically, can government afford to spend on the sort of infrastructure vision that we all three of us have laid out as important for minimizing the cost of intra-area trade and collaboration within East Africa? The answer is yes. Governments can afford this, all right? Because right now, domestic resource mobilization in the countries of East Africa, is basically 17% or lower. 17% or lower. The IMF has a benchmark globally that for countries to really to sustain the kind of investment we're talking about, they should have domestic resource mobilization of about 34 to 35% of GDP. All right. So what that means basically is that the countries of East Africa are way below the optimum necessary. And so if they were to do a great deal more to mobilize tax revenues, property taxes, income taxes, corporate taxes, and raise the level to nearer 30 as a group, the miracles basically can happen, because by moving towards 30, we're talking about the equivalent of 5% of the GDP of the region. I mean, think of the GDP of the region, 5% of that. It means everything East Africa currently gets in remittances, everything East Africa currently gets in donors, donor financed, right? 5% of GDP of the region exceeds all that. So yes, the answer is they can indeed finance the infrastructure. Finally, at one point in the 80s, we all recall, right? Donors abandoned Kenya. And what did the Kenyans do? Kenyans self-relied. They basically tackled domestic resource mobilization. They looked for taxation, and they basically did all kinds of, and raised the share of revenue, basically to almost at one point 24, 25%, which till today, Kenya is the highest in terms of domestic resource mobilization. So again, unequivocally, the answer is yes, if countries can move in this direction. And of course, COVID tells us all that we have no choice. We have no choice. You think of my own country, Nigeria, where domestic resource mobilization is 7.5%. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's the same level as Central African Republic. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? So this is why in the COVID era, we need to do much more to raise revenues at home. Now back to the question of all the things we've been discussing in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which, Ali, if I recall, was your question. Now, as a student of economic integration, particularly integration of Africa, it's very easy to focus on the challenges posed by the multiplicity of integration schemes across the continent. I mean, you heard of the RECs in the West, ECOWAS, in the center, ECAS. Of course, we've been dwelling on the East African community. You have SADC, you have COMESA, all these things. I remember as a graduate student at the University of Sussex, we used to describe this as a spaghetti bowl of intermixed and interlinking integration schemes that characterize the African continent. But that is the old way of looking at Africa's integration. It is indeed the old way. Why do I say that? Because today, the African continent has resolved and found a new solidarity, a new way of collaborating. Let me just cite a couple of examples, and I'm sure the ambassador will agree as well. There is now an African passport. When I was growing up, the idea, the very notion that one day we will have an African passport was impossible. There is now free movement across the entire continent. There is a single African air transport market. There is recently the Africa CDC, Africa Center for Disease Control and for Disease Prevention and Control. And we all know that the reason today our continent has excelled, and I mean that sincerely, compared to every other continent on the planet in terms of the way COVID-19 was handled, was because Africa has an Africa CDC that from the get-go began to basically take charge and make stuff happen, right? So, and then of course, we have the African Continental Free Trade Area, which takes effect January 1 in a couple of weeks, basically. So my way of thinking is that the old idea of spaghetti, a lot of multiplicity, a lot of conflicts of treaties, obligations, sure, there are challenges, but in the new order, I think that the focus on the continent will continue, of course, to be on free trade, right? But because if you look at the African Continental Free Trade Area Treaty, and for students of integration, you read it carefully, 90% of tariffs are supposed to be eliminated, right? Now, we are so obsessed on tariff. Why? Because that's how the Europeans did it in the Treaty of Rome, 1958. But Europeans trade with each other. Africans don't trade with each other as much because of a variety of reasons that other speakers mentioned. The key which will sober and focus the leader's mind is the non-tariff barriers. And all morning, that's what we've been talking about, the infrastructure deficiencies on the continent, which if you were to eliminate the infrastructure deficiencies on the continent, using the newfound solidarity and collaborative way, Africans have now found a we feeling, a way of working together, of integrating together. If we can channel our minds to these non-tariff barriers, particularly infrastructure, roads, railways, bridges of the type we talked about, therein lies the future of an integrated continent. Some time back, we all heard of Nkrumah's vision of an integrated Africa, where he imagined that a businessman will have breakfast in Cape Town and have lunch in Cairo and be in Dakar for a meeting and return to Lagos for a nightcap, all on the same day. All on the same day. This was a very powerful vision of Nkrumah's. And I'm hoping that in my lifetime, we can actually realize this vision, because that is the Africa we want. That is the integrated Africa. And unless we can channel our minds to that, if we continue to sign papers and all this on trade, how do we raise the trade from 14% to 17%? Don't get me wrong, those are important. But we're missing the bulk of the game where the action is non-tariff barriers. Finally, something happened in East Asia recently. The ASEAN group of countries, +5, have now signed a new deal of integrating in the Pacific, East Asia and the Pacific. Now, everybody is writing that has now become the largest integration scheme on earth. Yes, when you take income and population. But if you take number of countries, African Continental Free Trade Area is the largest on earth. But the point is, now that the Asians have gotten their act together in this new mega entity, how will our policymakers in the African Union respond to that? Are we going to have bilateral deals when the time comes with the new Asian entity? Or are we as African Union, under the auspices of the African Free Trade Area, going to negotiate with them as continent to continent? My thinking is that there are a lot of merits in going in this direction, and a lot of frivolous, expensive way if we do bilaterally. Okay? Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Aloysius. So for our final round of questions, let me just ask a follow-up question to what you were saying. When you mentioned, the fact that there's an African passport, these free trade agreements, there's clearly a move towards more integration. Yeah. But now I'm thinking of also what Ambassador Negm mentioned, which is the fact that it seems to be leadership driven. But there seems to be a bit of an issue when it comes to institutionalization and probably just sort of organizing everything together. And it's one thing to come up with these initiatives, and it's another thing to really make sure that they're institutionalized and that they're designed in the right way. So that's a question for you. And for Miguel, if you could please talk about the Gulf, investment flows to East Africa. If you could elaborate a little bit on that. I mean, is it a hype? Is it, exaggerated, or is there really a big room for investments, for flowing from the Gulf to East Africa? And if there are, then which, sectors are we talking about, and which countries? And for Ambassador Negm, if you could please talk about how the African Free Trade Agreement affects Sudan. This was a question we have from one of our audience members, just asking how it could affect Sudan, particularly given the US sanctions on it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alia.
Dr. Aloysius. Yeah,
thank you. I think that the past is important because history is important, but it's also important that right now, the world as we know it has changed. The internet, connectivity, technology. It's inconceivable on the African continent of 2030, let alone 2050, which was the basis of the projections we discussed this morning. It's absolutely inconceivable that the youths, that the civil society will let our leaders get away with just signing treaties and putting it on the shelf. It just won't happen, because now we have this army of interested participants who will hold us accountable for actions we take. And that, in my view, is a very good thing. That's why I'm very optimistic that basically the days of signing treaties and they're over. Okay, if otherwise, when you go to the polls next time, guess who's going to be in the majority perpetually now going forward on the African continent? It's young people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Miguel?
Yes, this is probably my last intervention, so let me just say this was very educative for myself, both with Ambassador and Dr. Aloysius, and thank you very much for those contributions. On your very specific question, let me respond from a commercial standpoint and avoiding sort of the political spiel on it. I haven't seen much, to be honest. I haven't seen much. And I don't think there is any magic attraction from the Gulf to East Africa or vice versa. On top of it, I would say the Gulf as a whole has become a net importer of capital rather than a net exporter of capital as it has been for many decades. The Gulf has its own challenges, needs to recycle the economy, needs to transform the economy. And so they will have a lot of capital consumption in their own economies. However, there are definitely economic complementarities between the two regions. And so if the economics make sense, if the right incentives are in place and the right, call it comparative advantages can be exploited, and I can see many of those, I'm sure there will be investment into the region, which can create jobs, which can spur growth in the region. But don't expect that to happen just because the Gulf is kind of on the other side and because there's a magic fate for the Gulf countries to invest in the region, whether it is political support, religious support, geographical support, whatever. No, it will all be based on the economic merits of the proposition. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Miguel. Dr. Nick?
Thank you very much, Alia. Actually, I didn't, that's why I didn't comment on it extensively. First of all, CFTA is not a magic wand. There is no magic wand solution for our African problems. Let's be very clear about this. So we are taking steps towards integration in order to make basically our lives better, our economic situation better, our political situation better, our security situation better, but not per se having the document, even with the ratification, will give us a solution. Definitely, countries that ratified, that submitted their tariffs, concessions, and schedules now, they will be part and parcel of evacuating and implementing the first phase of trade as of 1st Jan 2021 of the agreement. So that will be the first thing. The question is, how will they benefit from it, even with submitting the tariffs and all of that? It depends on what they produce and what they consume. So if you do not produce enough, if you don't have power of consumption, then it's, as I always joke, ink on paper. It's not going to reach any goal. We're not going to reach anywhere. If we're talking about, I will, for a change, take the optimistic approach of Dr. Ordu. So I'm not optimistic as usual, but my normal is not like that. But I'll try to take an optimistic approach and say, simply, the aspirations that led to the adoption of CFTA, that led to this speedy signature and entry into force of the CFTA as an agreement. I'm handling the depository for the African Union. I have 65 treaties I work as a depository for, and I can tell you that we have some for decades that not been ratified and they did not enter into force. So it was a miracle to have the agreement entering into force in 1 year. It shows a political will? Yes, it shows a political will. But the political will has to be merged with realities. The realities we have to see. If we're talking about Sudan, for example, the production of Sudan that will be subject to the lifting of the tariff barriers, together with the shipping cost to the other African countries that will assist Sudan in having foreign currency to assist in development. It's ABC development. So this is not something that we are creating, it's there. But if they do not produce enough, if they do not match the standards that will make them ship under CFTA, nothing will go. The connectivity of Sudan to its neighbors, for example, because of course, like the issue of Darfur, whatever is going on in South Sudan, any incident happening, we know the deterioration of the security situation in the Sahel region. So all of this also will affect the trade with Sudan. As rightly indicated by Dr. Urdu, the connectivity that we aspired for had never been achieved. To travel within West Africa is a disaster. You know, Professor, you're from Nigeria. It's just like, I had once to travel an entire day for a trip that can take 1 hour. So why? Because sometimes we have even to go to Addis and come back to the West or to Central Africa. So this is where also is a problem. When it comes to the sanctions, and this is why I said I didn't shed light on the external factors outside of the East Africa region, because not only the East Africa region, if you're talking about the surrounding countries of the East Africa region and their interests, some of them are big countries, some of them are smaller countries, some of them with major security threats to East Africa region. So this is something also we have to think about. The intervention of the interests of the wider world in the region, in Africa in general, and in East Africa in particular. Because we have now, if you think about foreign investors in the continent, in East Africa region, China is #1 investor today. Okay, what formula? What kind of BITs we had, the bilateral investment treaties we had with China? What kind of dispute settlement mechanism we have with China? What kind of commitments we are committing to China, be it for not only about whatever is happening in the land, but whatever is happening in the sea. Yesterday, I was in another symposium on the sea, speaking about IU fishing, speaking about the illegal exploitation of the exclusive economic zone of African countries that also affects the East African coastline, affects the development and the income of the communities benefiting from the sea. We have a huge community benefiting from their lives are built on the sea. So that's also another aspect. If you move to the UN, the US sanctions, when it comes, of course, politically, what will happen with the change of government in the US, we cannot predict what will happen with the Sudan. The US, when it comes to sanctions, because sanctions were before the Trump administration, in order to lift the sanctions on Sudan, for the US, they have benchmarks. They want Sudan to pass through these benchmarks. Once they cross these benchmarks, then it will get better for the Sudanese when it comes only to the US. But you still have the EU, for example, working with Sudan. The rest of Africa is working with Sudan. So it's not isolated from the world. We have seen like Iran was under US sanctions forever, and still the economy of Iran, it was still ongoing well. So they were able to develop. So this is where we have to think. For me, when it comes to Sudan, number one is to finalize the stabilization of Sudan. Once we stabilize Sudan properly, the impact of the outside world will be curtailed because there will be means to develop economically in Sudan. That will make a huge difference, I believe, in the situation. And I would like, of course, before I conclude, to thank my fellow panelists, and I really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you very much, Ali.
Thank you so much, Dr. Negm. And with this, we come to the conclusion of our webinar today. Thank you again to our panelists. I see some of our audience members still sent us some questions that we weren't able to address, unfortunately. But please feel free to send your questions and email us, and we'll happily pass them on to the panelists if we haven't addressed your questions. And yeah, I would like to thank you again. I think we had a very, very interesting conversation today. We tackled challenges, optimistic scenarios, and some reality checks. So very, very useful. Again, thank you all, and have a good day.